call these the fall webworms. What's their scientific name?
Their scientific name is Hyphanthria cunea. It's a moth that belongs to the family Arctiidae, which is the common name of which is tiger moths. Most moths are nocturnal or night flying. The tiger moths are one of the few moth groups that fly during the day.
And what do they look like when they're in their adult phase?
The adults in this case are a very beautiful snow white color. Some populations have the white flecked with little bits of black. A lot of the day flying moths are brightly colored like butterflies with oranges, contrasting blacks and reds and yellows and such. But these are a very nice snow white.
Maybe you could give us an idea of the life cycle of this insect.
Okay, these insects overwinter as pupae in the cocoon. And in the late spring, the adults emerge from the cocoon. They mate, they lay a clutch of eggs, typically on the undersides of the leaf of one of their host plants. And the adults typically will lay just one clutch and they die soon after. So their lifespan is only a couple of weeks or so. From late spring on, the caterpillars are very slowly growing. And so it's something of a misnomer to call them fall webworms because they really get their start late in the spring. They grow slowly all through the summer, but they become very noticeable in the fall. And so people associate them with the fall. Right. They actually can go through, depending on latitude and such, they can go through multiple generations. So in some populations, they might actually mature in midsummer and go through that cycle again, and then another generation will continue on.
Right.
And ultimately, this time of year, in the fall, this is the last generation, and when the caterpillars are done growing, they'll abandon that silken nest that they've built, and they'll spin a cocoon down in the leaf litter or in the soil.
Oh, so this is like an intermediate stage of the actual pupae where they're maturing into an adult. They're in a solitary kind of, where we think of a caterpillar.
That's right, they're solitary
itself.
At that point. They remain gregarious in these colonies as caterpillars as they grow, but once they fully grow, they abandon the tent and they go it alone.
Okay, you said gregarious. How can a caterpillar be gregarious?
Well, gregarious, just as a descriptor, you could use that to describe any animal that lives in groups.
Uh-huh.
And so here you have a sizable group that can number hundreds of caterpillars. Typically, at least in the beginning, all siblings, all derive from a single clutch of eggs.
Uh-huh.
So gregariousness is just a descriptor of the fact that they all stay together.
I see. Well, is there a reason that they stay together like that?
Yeah, well, there are probably many reasons, probably as many reasons as there are species that live together.
Uh-huh.
And it's debated which factors are the most important in any given case. But some people think in the case of these caterpillars, for example, one of the benefits of living together is effectively being able to spin that big silken tent. Mm-hmm. Silk as a protein is a fairly expensive material to produce, and any one caterpillar couldn't really produce a sizable nest or tent of that magnitude. They may gain defensive benefits, protection from living in that tent. Some species use tents like that to create a kind of microenvironment where it's nice and warm. They're shielded from cool breezes and from rain. It's not clear if that's important in this case or not.
Do they enshrine enough leaves to feed on for the entire period they're going to be in that tent?
Well, one of the things that makes this species interesting is that they continue to expand the tent to engulf leaves as they run out of food. So they fall into a category of caterpillar foraging that's called patch restricted. That is to say, they start feeding in one place and they spin their silken nest around that place. But as they run out of food in the nest, they periodically leave it and silk more leaves into the structure. So they never really have to leave home. They just keep making their home bigger and bigger and bigger.
Well, are there any trees that they seem to favor, any one species? It's all deciduous leaves, right?
It is all deciduous, but in the case of the fall webworm, they feed on a huge number of hosts. I think something like almost 100 different tree and shrub species have been documented as hosts. Here they especially love walnut, black cherry, sourwood, but you can find them on oaks, on maples, on poplars, really great diversity.
And as you've said, they don't hurt the tree that
They don't
they're
hurt
in.
the tree. They typically, they can defoliate a given branch, but typically those leaves are all consumed near the end of the season when the tree is really pretty much finished doing most of its photosynthesizing and growing. It's going to lose its leaves soon anyway. It is possible that younger trees, if they're repeatedly defoliated and if they're completely covered with the webworms so that they lose all of their leaves repeatedly, that could probably hurt them in the long run.
You are an entomologist
That's
by
right.
profession. Do you have your PhD?
I do.
Specifically in some study of insects, or?
My specialty, well, my PhD work was in population genetics, insect population genetics, and in particular I studied eastern tent caterpillars. And since then I've become interested more broadly in insect behavior, especially group living behavior, social behavior. And I sometimes still do population genetic work in connection with that.
So would this kind of community be one of the types of populations you would study?
Yeah, although I've not studied fall webworms, this would be a good example of the kind of species that I'd be interested in. My students and I have looked at various questions relating to how and why they live together, essentially, and you can look at that from different perspectives. In some cases we're interested in looking at the mechanisms that help them stay together. I mentioned that these are patch-restricted foragers. They never really have to leave their nest to find food. But there are some species, like the eastern tent caterpillar, that doesn't engulf its food. Those caterpillars have to leave the nest and go find it. And it turns out that they have a very elaborate communication system. They use trails, chemical trails, to help find their way back home and even communicate where the best food finds might be to other tent mates. And so that's what I mean by mechanism. We're interested in figuring out how these insects talk to each other, why they talk to each other. Just recently, I've had a project, I've been working on it for several years now, and it's just been published by Harvard University Press, just came out in late August. It's called The Other Insect Societies. When specialists and non-specialists think about insect societies, they think in terms of ants, bees, wasps. Those are the dominant and obvious insect societies. But from pretty early on in my academic career, I became interested in the more unusual, non-traditional, let's say, studied forms of group living, like caterpillars, for example, or beetles. And so my book is called The Other Insect Societies, to draw attention to these other groups. And it covers a broad array of insect groups and also non-insects like spiders and scorpions and their relatives as well.
So spiders and scorpions also have society or
some of them,
communities?
Yes, some of them do. Yeah, and you can define sociality in a number of different ways. There's something of a spectrum of sociality. And so one common expression is simply family life, living in a family colony. And often that involves parental care, either given solely by one parent, typically maternal care, the mother, or sometimes both parents. And then in other cases, you have multiple families that join forces, and you have a group of adults that might or might not be related, and then their collective offspring, and they cooperate in building a nest or finding food or defending the young, feeding the young, any number of things. And then further along the spectrum, you have cases of insects that don't have parental care at all, but they're sort of communal. They all live together, sort of like these webworms do. They live together to help, in this case, perhaps build a shelter together, or in the case of the tent caterpillars, help each other more effectively ward off predators or find food.
Well, you wrote a paper for the American Philosophical Society, is that?
I did, yeah.
And it was interesting, I read it was about how people take their vision of human societies and impose it on insect societies to prove their point about human society.
Yeah, that was a fun project. I discovered that people often do tend to project onto the natural world their preconceived notions of the way people ought to live, and they sort of seek justification or examples of that in the natural world. You see that very nicely illustrated when it comes to making sense of these social insects, because these societies, they in some ways kind of mirror human societies, and it makes sense as other organisms, they have the same kinds of concerns, making a living, defending the group and building a home and finding food and rearing young, except they do it in very interesting and diverse ways. But yeah, there's a tendency in Western thought especially for philosophers, political philosophers, poets and others to look at insect societies and then see in those societies elements of the ideal human society.
Right, particularly like class structure.
That's right.
And
yes.
and the leadership.
That's right. There are two ways to look at the structure of these societies, and one is in terms of a rigid hierarchy, sort of a class-structured society. The other end of the spectrum would be to look at them as sort of communal, almost like socialist states. And what you find is, over time, you find both examples, both ends of the spectrum represented. We have in the 16th century, 15th century, they would be bees, for example, or ants would be cited as great examples of divine right monarchies. A bit later, they're held up as nice examples of a commonwealth. Still later, we find in the early 20th century, we find some writers talking about them as perfect communist states. So it is interesting. They can be sort of blank slates upon which we write what we want to see.
And you said this was a cherry that we're looking at right now?
This is a black cherry, yeah, a pretty young one. And we're seeing, 3 colonies, probably originating with 3 different clutches of eggs. And I would say that most of the caterpillars have now abandoned their nests. And so you see a few stragglers still here within this one. I'm not sure if you can easily see that with the camera. Yeah. There are several over here. I dare say within a week or more, they'll be gone.
Yeah.
Yeah, you can see here how when they were young, they couldn't eat the whole leaf, and so they sort of skeletonized these leaves. They kind of graze the green stuff on the surface. But then as they get older, they can eat the leaves whole, and so down lower you find these leaves are completely completely gone. They're completely consumed. You also see, it looks like a real mess in there. There's a lot of fecal pellets, a lot of frass. There's something of a mass of silk, but it's hard to see it perhaps, but there is a little bit of structure to it. They can actually pretty easily maneuver in there. So if they were, one of the benefits of a structure like this might be defensive. And so if a bird or some, predatory wasps were harassing them, the group could withdraw to the very center. And larger insects like those predatory wasps would have a really hard time getting through, that maze of silk inside and attacking them.
Well, how did you get into bugs in the first place?
Bugs came to me kind of late. I was a kid naturalist. I was always outside, poking around in the woods. And from an early age, I got into birding and identifying wildflowers. I don't know why I never really got into looking closely at insects. It wasn't until I was in college, actually. And just by happenstance, I did a summer research project with a faculty member who studied eastern tent caterpillars. Surprise, surprise. And his name is Terry Fitzgerald. He's at SUNY Cortland in upstate New York. And I was just really amazed at how fascinating and complex these little caterpillar societies could be. And I was intrigued by Fitzgerald's ingenuity, in coming up with clever experiments to try to, tease apart what they're doing, get them to yield their secrets of how they're communicating and why they're communicating and what they're doing exactly. It really kind of opened my eyes to a whole huge aspect of the natural world that I had neglected before.
Seems like I've heard somewhere that the number of insect species compared to the number of the rest of the species on Earth is like more than half. Is what?
Yeah, I don't know the exact count these days, but it certainly is true that insects outnumber pretty much all other animal species combined. In fact, beetles alone really make for the lion's share of named animal species. And it really kind of gives you pause to realize that this is such a phenomenally large group of organisms.
Especially since it seems like we spend a lot of our time at war with insects.
Yeah, well, that's partly why their diversity is partly why we're always at war with them, because they're so successful, and they make their living in almost every way imaginable, that inevitably some of those ways come into conflict with, our way of life.
Yeah.
And so inevitably, there are large numbers that become agricultural pests or vector diseases, or annoy us by parasitizing us for our blood, and so on. And then in some cases, simply seeming unsightly. These are harmless caterpillars, but of course, a messy-looking tent like this, in a species that's defoliating a young tree in somebody's garden, is generally not tolerated.
Yeah. But they are also extremely, because there's that many of them, obviously they're crucial to the whole ecosystem of the planet. We couldn't get along without them.
Absolutely. You could make a career of studying the web of interactions just associated with this species and any one of its host trees. There's a whole nexus of predators and parasites that make use of it, and then birds and other organisms that make use of them as well as their predators. There are little inquilines, there are small insects and other very small invertebrate animals that might make their home in here, sort of like innocuous insects might live in the corners of our homes. They don't really hurt us or anything else, but they take advantage of our domiciles. Well, many species like fall webworms, their nests also are domiciles for other insects and their relatives. So there's an interesting little web of interaction. What looks like refuse here, which is perhaps the fecal pellets or the cast skins of the caterpillars, is actually a nutritional resource for something else. Right. Not to mention all of the prokaryotes, the bacteria and archaea and other organisms. Okay, guys, come here. Unlike some fuzzy caterpillars, these hairs are not stinging hairs. They're not urticating, although some people might have an allergic reaction to them. But yeah, and you can, when you look at the caterpillar, just the general appearance of it, you can get a sense of how this species is a relative of the woolly bear.
Yeah.
You see, there's some very general similarities there, not nearly as densely fuzzy as woolly bears, but the same kind of morphology, the black head and lots of rows of tufts of hairs. And they are indeed in the same family. There you go.
So it'll be able to just go right back in.
It'll eventually wriggle its way back in and join its friends in there.